On July 8, 1968, Harlem buried a legend. Bumpy Johnson was gone. The streets were quiet in a way they had never been before. Not peaceful, just uncertain. Like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would step into the shadow Bumpy left behind. The funeral was packed, politicians pretending they didn't know him, hustlers pretending they weren't scared, old women crying because Bumpy had paid their rent when no one else would. The Italian mob watched from a distance, respectful but calculating. Rival crews whispered threats that hadn't yet found a target. And Frank Lucas. Frank said nothing. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He didn't rush to make moves. Because Frank Lucas knew something nobody else did. Everyone believed Bumpy Johnson died broke. That was the story the city accepted. A man who ruled Harlem for 40 years yet lived modestly. No flashy cars, no diamond rings, no mansions in the suburbs. When the paperwork was checked, Bumpy's accounts barely showed $50,000. To most people, that confirmed the myth. Bumpy was powerful but careful, smart but not greedy. But Frank Lucas knew the truth. And the truth was buried deeper than any grave in Harlem. The day after the funeral, while the city argued over who would inherit Harlem's underworld, Frank Lucas was sitting alone inside Bumpy Johnson's apartment at 409 Edgecombe Avenue. The place felt hollow. The walls still smelled faintly of cigar smoke and whiskey. The furniture was simple, clean, almost disappointing for a man of Bumpy's reputation. Sunlight crept through the window, spilling onto the floor like it didn't belong there anymore. Frank sat on the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. This wasn't grief. This was calculation. 3 months earlier, Bumpy had called Frank over late at night. No entourage, no guards, just the two of them and a bottle of whiskey sitting between them like a third witness. Bumpy stood by the window, looking out at Harlem like a king surveying land he already owned. "Frank," he said, voice calm, almost tired. "You know what separates a smart gangster from a dead one?" Frank didn't answer right away. He had learned long ago that Bumpy didn't ask questions unless he already knew the answer. "What's that, boss?" Frank finally said. Bumpy took a slow sip of whiskey. A smart gangster never lets anyone know how much money he really has. He turned and looked directly at Frank. Not the government, not the mob, not his crew, not even his own family. Frank nodded. "Because the moment people know you're rich," Bumpy continued, "they start planning how to take it." Frank leaned forward. "So you hide it." Bumpy smiled, not wide, not proud, just knowing. "I've been hiding mine for 30 years. That sentence stayed in the air longer than it should have. 30 years of skimming," Bumpy said. 30 years of putting money where nobody would ever think to look. Not the cops, not the IRS, not the Italians. Frank hesitated before asking the question, burning a hole in his chest. "How much we talking about?" Bumpy stared at the glass in his hand, swirling the whiskey slowly. $50 million. Frank's breath caught. "Cash?" Frank laughed once, sharp and nervous. "Boss, 50 million in cash don't just disappear." Bumpy finally turned fully toward him. "It does if you're smarter than everyone looking for it." There was a long pause. Then Bumpy said something that changed Frank Lucas's life forever. "I'm not going to be around much longer." Frank opened his mouth to protest, but Bumpy raised a hand. "My heart ain't what it used to be, and when I go, that money can't fall into the wrong hands." He stepped closer to Frank. "I want Harlem strong, I want it protected, and I want someone smart enough to hold it." Frank swallowed. "You want me to have it?" Bumpy studied him carefully, like a jeweler inspecting a diamond. "I want you to earn it." Frank's eyebrows tightened. "When I die," Bumpy continued, "I'm not telling anyone where it is. Not you, not my family, not God himself." Frank's pulse started pounding. "If you can find it," Bumpy said calmly, "it's yours, all of it. And if I can't?" Bumpy smiled again. "Then you weren't worthy of it." Frank stared at him, unsure if this was a test or a confession. "Build something bigger than what I built," Bumpy said quietly. "Make my empire look like a lemonade stand." 3 months later, Bumpy Johnson collapsed at a restaurant and never woke up. And now Frank Lucas was sitting alone in his apartment, staring at the ghost of that promise. Frank searched for 6 straight hours. He checked behind paintings, under rugs, inside vents. He pulled drawers apart, tapped walls, pried loose floorboards. He checked the bathroom, the kitchen, even inside the refrigerator. Nothing. No safe. No secret compartment. No hidden vault. By the time Frank collapsed back onto the couch, sweat soaked through his shirt. $50 million doesn't vanish. Unless it was never here to begin with. That's when Frank realized his first mistake. Bumpy would never hide it here. Too obvious, too risky. If the police ever raided this place, and they had many times, they would tear it apart in minutes. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive 40 years by being careless. So Frank did what Bumpy taught him to do. He stopped thinking like Frank Lucas and started thinking like Bumpy Johnson. 3 days later, Frank stood in the middle of Harlem with a new question. Where would a man who trusted no one hide a fortune no one could ever trace? Bumpy owned buildings, warehouses, apartments, businesses, 17 properties in total. Frank searched every single one. Basements, attics, boiler rooms, storage lockers, false walls, ceilings. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. Not $1. That's when doubt crept in. What if Bumpy lied? What if the 50 million never existed? But Frank pushed the thought away. Bumpy Johnson didn't lie. If he said the money was real, then it was real. And then Frank remembered something else Bumpy used to say. Something small, something easy to forget. The best place to hide something valuable is right in front of people's faces. Frank stopped walking. In plain sight, Bumpy had said. Because everyone looks for secrets in secret places. Frank felt his chest tighten. What did Bumpy own that everyone knew about, but nobody questioned? And then it hit him. So hard it almost knocked the breath out of him. The funeral home. Renaissance Funeral Home. 125th Street. A place of silence, respect, death. Bumpy bought it in the 1950s, claiming he wanted black families to have dignity in death. The community respected it. The cops ignored it. The mob never touched it. Because who searches a funeral home? That night, just before midnight, Frank Lucas unlocked the door. The building was dark, still, cold. Rows of polished caskets lined the showroom like soldiers standing at attention. Flowers sat wilting under dim lights. In the back, the air smelled of chemicals and metal. Frank walked slowly, his heartbeat echoing louder than his footsteps. Then he saw it. The freezer. A heavy steel door, industrial, the kind used to store bodies before burial. Frank hesitated. If this was nothing, he was chasing ghosts. He pulled the handle. Cold air exploded into the room. Inside were 3 gurneys, each covered with white sheets. Frank stepped forward and lifted the first sheet. A real body, elderly woman, peaceful. Second gurney. A middle-aged man, heart attack maybe. Then Frank reached the third. His hands trembled as he lifted the sheet. And time stopped. Because it wasn't a body. It was money. Stacks of $100 bills wrapped tight in plastic, frozen solid, layer after layer. Frank ripped the sheet away completely. The entire gurney was cash. Millions. Frank started laughing, loud, uncontrolled. Bumpy, you genius bastard. But this was only the beginning. Because what Frank didn't know yet was that while he had just found the money, someone else had already started looking for it. Frank Lucas stood inside that freezer longer than he realized. Cold air burned his lungs, but he didn't move. He couldn't, because what he was looking at wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that Bumpy Johnson had planned everything. Proof that this was never about cash alone. This was a test. Frank pulled the sheet back slowly, exposing the entire gurney. Every inch was covered in tightly packed stacks of $100 bills, sealed in plastic, frozen hard like blocks of ice. No mold. No moisture damage. No decay. Preserved perfectly. Frank whispered to himself, almost in disbelief. You hid it like the dead, because nobody questions the dead. He checked the freezer again. There were more. Not one, not two, 6 gurneys in total, each one disguised as a body waiting for burial. Frank did the math in his head, fast, precise. Roughly 8 million per gurney. $48 million. Bumpy hadn't exaggerated. Frank sank to the floor, his back against the metal wall, surrounded by frozen air and frozen money. For a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not fear of getting caught. Fear of responsibility. This wasn't just wealth, this was power, and power always came with enemies. Frank stayed there until nearly 3 in the morning. He didn't touch the money, not yet, because Bumpy had been right about one thing above all else. The safest place for money is the place nobody knows to look. Frank locked the freezer, walked out of the funeral home, and disappeared into the Harlem night with a plan already forming in his mind. But Frank Lucas wasn't the only one who believed Bumpy Johnson left something behind. 1 month later, inside a dull federal office in Manhattan, FBI agent Dennis McCarthy received a tip that refused to leave his head. The informant was nervous, shaking, the kind of man who talked fast because silence scared him. Bumpy didn't die broke, the man said. He had money, a lot of it. How much? McCarthy asked. The informant hesitated. 50 million cash. McCarthy didn't laugh. He'd been chasing Bumpy Johnson for 15 years. Arrest attempts, surveillance, wiretaps, informants that vanished or turned up dead. Bumpy always stayed one step ahead. And now he was gone. But if the money was real, then the game wasn't over. $50 million could cripple criminal operations across New York. It could fund investigations for years. It could be the one victory McCarthy never got while Bumpy was alive. McCarthy assembled a small team, 6 agents, all veterans, all obsessed with organized crime. They started where everyone starts. Bumpy's apartment. Nothing. They searched properties, warehouses, businesses, questioned family members, pressured former associates, dug through records. Nothing. No bank accounts. No offshore trails. No safe deposit boxes. For months, the investigation stalled. Until a second informant spoke up. This one had known Bumpy personally. He used to joke about it, the man said. Said he kept it cold. McCarthy's pen stopped moving. Cold, he asked. Yeah, cold. Said even if the cops found it, they wouldn't recognize it. McCarthy leaned back in his chair. Cold meant refrigeration, storage, ice, preservation. The FBI went to work. They investigated every cold storage facility in Harlem. Meat lockers, ice houses, food warehouses, commercial freezers. They searched manifests, questioned workers, dug through old contracts. 3 months passed. Nothing. McCarthy's supervisors started pushing back. You're chasing a ghost, one of them said. We've burned enough money on this. But McCarthy refused to let go. Because while the FBI searched for frozen buildings, Frank Lucas was quietly visiting a frozen room. Once a month, always at night. Frank never took more than he needed. 200,000 one month. 300 the next. He kept his spending modest. No flashy cars, no wild purchases, just enough to quietly lay foundations. But Frank made one mistake. He developed a routine. And routines are how law enforcement catches people. McCarthy had Frank Lucas under surveillance, not because he knew Frank had the money, but because Frank didn't make sense. Frank had no official job, no inheritance, yet his lifestyle was slowly changing. New suits, better meals, small investments through intermediaries. Nothing loud, but enough to notice. McCarthy ordered a wiretap. 6 months of silence. Then a pattern emerged. Once a month, Frank drove to 125th Street, late at night, parked near Renaissance Funeral Home, stayed inside for 30 minutes, left. Every time, McCarthy frowned. Why would a man like Frank Lucas visit a funeral home at midnight? McCarthy pulled the records. The funeral home had been owned by Bumpy Johnson since the 1950s. After Bumpy's death, ownership transferred to a shell corporation. No names, no faces. That was enough. McCarthy got a warrant. September 1969. 6 in the morning. The FBI raided Renaissance Funeral Home. They came prepared. Dogs, metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar. They searched everything. The showroom, the offices, the embalming rooms, the basement. They opened every casket, checked walls, floors, ceilings. 8 hours later, nothing, not a single dollar. McCarthy stood in the middle of the building, furious. He could feel it. Something had been here, something was still here. But feeling wasn't evidence. As they were leaving, the funeral director, an older man named Samuel, approached McCarthy. "Agent," he said calmly, "may I ask what you were looking for?" McCarthy studied him. "We believe Bumpy Johnson hid money in this building." Samuel laughed. "Agent, this is a funeral home. We store bodies, not cash." McCarthy didn't believe him. But belief didn't matter. The FBI walked out empty-handed. And the money stayed exactly where it was. Frozen, silent, invisible. For the next 10 years, Dennis McCarthy couldn't let it go. He chased rumors, followed whispers, interviewed men who lied, men who disappeared, men who ended up dead. His colleagues mocked him. They called him obsessed, called the case his white whale. But McCarthy knew. Somewhere in Harlem, $50 million had laughed at the FBI. And he had walked right past it. What McCarthy didn't know was that while he searched for the past, Frank Lucas was building the future. And that future was about to explode into something no one could ignore. By 1970, Harlem had a new ruler. Most people just didn't know his name yet. Frank Lucas moved quietly, almost invisibly. The kind of man you could pass on the street 100 times and never remember. No flashy cars, no bodyguards, no public displays of power. That was the lesson Bumpy Johnson left him with. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits. Using small withdrawals from the frozen cash, Frank began investing in something bigger than street-level hustle. He wasn't interested in corners or petty territory wars. Those got men killed. What Frank wanted was control, from the source to the streets. And that meant heroin. Frank understood something most gangsters didn't. The real money wasn't in selling drugs. It was in owning the supply. While rival crews fought each other over scraps, Frank went overseas. Vietnam, Southeast Asia, places American law enforcement barely understood, let alone monitored. He cut out the middlemen. No Italian mafia tax. No inflated prices. No unreliable suppliers. Frank's heroin was purer, cheaper, and more consistent than anything on the streets. And it sold itself. Within a year, Frank Lucas was making over $1 million a day. Cash flowed in rivers, but Frank didn't change. He still dressed modestly, still ate in quiet restaurants, still moved like a man with nothing to prove. Behind the scenes, he corrupted cops, paid off customs officials, bought loyalty with precision, not emotion. By 1971, Frank Lucas controlled Harlem. The Italians noticed, and instead of challenging him, they partnered with him. That's how dangerous Frank had become. Detective Richie Roberts noticed him too. Roberts was different from most cops. Clean, uncorrupted, obsessed with patterns, he noticed things others ignored. Like how a man with no visible income always paid cash. Like how dealers arrested on the street all mentioned the same quiet supplier. And then came the moment that changed everything. March 1971. Madison Square Garden. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. Celebrities everywhere, politicians, crime bosses, the kind of event where status was measured by where you sat and what you wore. Frank Lucas walked in wearing a chinchilla fur coat. Custom-made, expensive, impossible to ignore. Richie Roberts saw it immediately. "Who the hell is that?" he asked. Someone told him. "That's Frank Lucas." Roberts frowned. Why would a Harlem driver be dressed like royalty? That coat shattered Frank's invisibility. For the first time, he wanted to be seen. And the system noticed. Over the next 4 years, Richie Roberts built a case brick by brick. Surveillance, wiretaps, financial tracking, informants who finally felt safe enough to talk. In 1975, the walls closed in. Frank Lucas's home in New Jersey was raided. Heroin, cash, ledgers, enough to bury him forever. Frank faced life in prison. Sitting alone in a cold cell, Frank thought about Bumpy's voice. "The moment you want people to know you're rich, you're finished." Frank had broken the rule. Now he had one move left. He would talk. Frank asked for a meeting. DEA, FBI, prosecutors. Dennis McCarthy was there, the man who had chased Bumpy's ghost for a decade. Frank looked at him and smiled. "You searched for Bumpy's money for 10 years, Frank said. And you walked right past it." McCarthy leaned forward. "What are you talking about?" Frank told them everything. The funeral home, the freezer, the gurneys, the bodies that weren't bodies. The room went silent. McCarthy felt sick. They had been there. They had searched it. And the money had been 10 feet away. Within hours, agents raided the funeral home again. This time, they went straight to the freezer. They lifted the sheets. And there it was. $48 million. Frozen. Untouched. The largest cash seizure in FBI history. Frank cooperated fully. He took down mob bosses, corrupt cops, entire networks. His sentence was reduced. 7 years. When Frank walked out of prison in 1981, people assumed he was finished. They were wrong, because the FBI only found what Frank allowed them to find. Most of the money, already gone, washed, hidden, invested. Just like Bumpy taught him. When the FBI carried $48 million out of Renaissance Funeral Home, the world believed the story was over. Case closed. Money seized. Empire destroyed. That's how history books like their endings. But real power doesn't disappear that easily. Because by the time federal agents pulled frozen stacks of cash from those gurneys, Frank Lucas had already done what Bumpy Johnson taught him to do years earlier. He had moved quietly. He had moved early. And most importantly, he had moved invisibly. When Frank first discovered the frozen fortune in 1968, he didn't touch most of it. That was the genius. Instead of emptying the freezer and attracting attention, Frank treated the money like a reservoir, something to be tapped, not drained. $2 million was all he took at first. That small withdrawal funded his earliest heroin shipments. It paid off officials, secured supply routes, and bought silence where silence mattered. That $2 million multiplied. Then Frank returned for more. $5 million. $10 million. But never in a way that looked suspicious. Frank laundered money the same way he lived, quietly. Real estate under false names. Shell corporations registered overseas. Restaurants that barely broke even on paper. Construction companies that always seemed to run over budget. By the time the FBI even suspected Frank Lucas was a kingpin, most of Bumpy's fortune no longer existed as cash. It had transformed into buildings, into businesses, into assets no warrant could easily touch. So when the government seized $48 million in 1975, they celebrated a victory that was already years too late. Frank Lucas had already won the long game. Inside his prison cell, Frank wasn't angry. He wasn't panicked. He was disappointed in himself. Not because he got caught, but because he broke the rule. Vanity. That chinchilla coat haunted him more than the prison walls. One moment of wanting recognition, one moment of stepping into the light. Bumpy's voice echoed in his head. The loud man dies. The silent man lives. Frank had survived Harlem, the mafia, the FBI, and the streets. But he almost lost everything because he wanted to be seen. That mistake cost him his empire. But it didn't cost him his future. In 1981, Frank Lucas walked out of prison. No entourage. No press conference. No victory lap. Just an older man with slower steps and sharper instincts. Most people assumed he was broke. That assumption was exactly what kept him safe. Frank never returned to power, never rebuilt an empire, never tried to reclaim Harlem. Because Frank had learned something deeper than crime. He had learned survival. He lived modestly, paid his taxes, avoided attention. When people saw him, they saw an old man, not a legend. But behind the scenes, Frank still had access to money. Not millions sitting in one place, but assets scattered across countries and companies. No paper trail that led directly to him. No single vault to raid. No freezer left to open. Just like Bumpy planned, Frank Lucas died in 2019 at the age of 88. Peacefully in his sleep. No headlines. No spectacle. And once again, the same question returned. How much money did he really have? Officially, his estate was modest, less than $500,000. Unofficially, no one knows. People close to Frank claimed he still had investments overseas, properties held under names long forgotten, accounts that never made it into any database. Because Frank Lucas understood what most people never do. Real wealth is invisible. The moment people can measure it, it's already vulnerable. Dennis McCarthy retired from the FBI in the mid-1980s. Years later, during a quiet interview, a reporter asked him one final question. What was the biggest case of your career? McCarthy didn't hesitate. Bumpy Johnson's missing money. The reporter laughed. But you found it. McCarthy shook his head. We found some of it, and that's when I realized the worst truth of all. What truth? That we searched the right place and still failed. McCarthy leaned back in his chair. That's when I learned the most important lesson of my career. The smartest criminals don't hide things in secret places. They hide them in obvious places because people overlook what they think they understand. That was Bumpy Johnson's real legacy. Not violence. Not crime. Not fear. Strategy. Bumpy turned money into something untouchable by disguising it as death itself. Frank Lucas turned that lesson into an empire, and then into a quiet life. Both men understood the same rule. Visibility is dangerous. Silence is survival. Bumpy died quietly. Frank lived quietly. And both outplayed the system in ways the system never fully understood. The FBI searched Harlem for 10 years. They raided buildings, followed rumors, spent millions, and walked past a fortune hidden under white sheets in a freezer. A fortune no one dared to question. Because nobody checks the dead. So here's the real question. Was Bumpy Johnson the smartest criminal in American history for hiding $48 million in plain sight? Or was Frank Lucas smarter for turning that hidden money into something the government could never fully reclaim? Leave that answer to history. But one lesson remains undeniable. If you want to survive power, stay invisible. And whatever you do, never wear a chinchilla coat